much you know about the life story of your grandmother, or your great-grandmother even. What choices did she make in life? What did she learn from them? What advice might she have to give you about the challenges you face today? So I'm a writer and an anthropologist, and I'm particularly interested in the way in which story and narrative shape our actual lived lives. I'm also a great fan of Alice Walker's work, and a few years ago I read a poem of hers entitled Calling All Grandmothers. And it got me thinking, because in the poem, Alice says that it's time for grandmothers and all who possess their spirit to rise up and take their place in the leadership of the world. So I began thinking about this. And the more I looked around me, the more I noticed a relative lack of older women in our politics, in our media, and in our public life. It was almost as if, as women get older, they become less visible. What would it be like if we had more older women whom we look to as our mentors and role models? If we had female elders who we consulted as a matter of course? Could their wisdom really dream into being a new world? What would it be like if younger women listened to older women's stories and it became a fundamental part of their education as they were growing up? So the more I thought about this, the more it began to dawn on me that perhaps Alice is right. Perhaps this is something that, as she puts it, the future of our species depends upon. And so, not being anywhere near being a grandmother yet myself, I started instead listening deliberately to elder women. And I decided to listen to them simply to hear their stories and to witness and record them. So for once, I avoided getting into a debate or a conversation or giving them my advice. And because I think there's wisdom in all of our stories, I started with women who I already knew in my family and in my professional and social circles. And so what I found was that the advice these women gave me when I asked them about their lives, the lives they'd lived, the choices they made, and the advice they had for younger women, was very different from many of the messages in our popular culture and media. The advice they gave told a very different story about what was important in life. Take Tricia, for example, who, as she looked back on her life's journey so far, having lived on 3 different continents and experimented with many different ways of life, from an enchanted childhood in Malaysia to leaving Berlin during the airlift and living since in all over Europe and in southern Africa as well. She said she felt the most important thing is that we should figure out what is important to us, the things that are absolutely indispensable, and we should stick to them fiercely. Now, I wonder how many of us have caught ourselves not quite doing that, changing our boundaries because of the wants and needs of others. How many women let someone else go first? How many women also have learned how not to rock the boat? Learned to change our opinions because of what we think other people think, maybe our families, our communities, people we choose our lives with. But Tricia said no. She said, figure out what's absolutely indispensable and stick to it. Then Angela, who on retirement had taken up life modeling, told me that she thinks it's important we should know that we should feel comfortable in our bodies, whatever their size and shape. And that we should know that the aging of our bodies, really know that the aging of our bodies is a natural cycle, and process. Angela told me hilarious stories about how sometimes she's walking down the street minding her own business and people stop her and remind her that they've drawn her naked or that she's hanging on their kitchen wall. She says that though she thinks of herself as a plump middle-aged woman, people have told her that curves are more interesting to draw. That one man told her that painting her was like walking up a mountain path, and that it made him feel that this was a woman with her soul intact. How would it change our lives and experiences as women if we took this advice from Angela to feel comfortable in our bodies and with their aging to heart? What would it mean for the many multinational companies that sell us face creams and diet plans? What space, time, and energy would be opened up in our lives if we truly decided here and now to accept ourselves exactly the way we are? As I sit down at Helen's kitchen table, I notice that it looks almost the same as it did when I used to come here as a child. This is the kitchen where I first discovered the croissants that come in the tin that you unroll. I think she got them from France, they're here now. And I thought they were fantastic. Helen's parents worked at Bletchley Park, where the code breakers were during the Second World War, and inspired by that, I think she spent most of her career in many different ways working for a more integrated and peaceful Europe. Helen told me that she felt passionately that we shouldn't waste resources. Now, many of us have heard this one before. Indeed, if, like me, your mother was a post-war child, you might also have grown up to refrains like waste not, want not. And haven't those mothers been proved right in so many ways? We're all at it now. Recycling, remaking, and reusing have become fashionable in a way they never were during my childhood in the 1980s. But in Helen's passionate words was a much deeper call, because she's not just saying, let's recycle. She's reminding us that the way in which we are using the world's resources is fundamentally unsustainable. We should think about the fact that we shouldn't always want new stuff. A new phone just because a new one's come out, a new car because there's a new model, a new kitchen because this one's not quite right. We shouldn't always want new stuff, not just because it doesn't make us happy in the long run, but because our resources on this planet are not will run out one day. They're not inexhaustible. I see Pat, an anthropologist and activist, as a mentor, and her work in Tanzania inspired a lot of my own work there, and I was lucky enough to work with her as a postgraduate student. She told me that she feels frustrated that despite the feminist work of the past decades, and in the 70s and 80s she was very involved in that work herself, that we still don't seem to question stereotypes. She told me that now as a grandmother, as she moves around supermarkets, picks her grandchildren up from school, she notices that it's still de rigueur to have pink for girls, blue for boys, that there are party cakes for a specific sex. She feels outraged that we don't question sexual stereotyping. Her advice to younger women is to step back and see things from different angles, not to fall for current representations of women. I talked to my mum, Jean, too, and was inspired by her lifelong commitment to follow her calling. First, to work on sustainable agriculture when it wasn't quite as fashionable as it is now, and later to choose to train us and become a woman priest. I noticed that when I talked to my mum with the intention of truly hearing her, I was able to hear and listen to stories and wisdom that I'd never heard in that way, even from my mum before. You see, I think sometimes we get so caught up in the conversation, in interacting, in discussing, that we rarely hear the whole story unless we truly set the intention simply to listen, to witness, and do our best to understand. And here's the thing, because this process of listening to older women actually brought me to a new awareness of a place within myself, like them, rails against a world in which we never think we look right. We waste resources. We struggle to have boundaries about the things that matter to us. Our choices and chances are different because we're born girls. And so many of us find it hard to have the confidence to follow our callings in life. And so I've come to believe that this practice of listening to older women, this practice could have an impact on us if we did it more and taught younger women to do it and encouraged older women to. Because you see, I think the things that we listen to and think about have an actual role in shaping our lives. Think about the power of some of the messages you grew up with. Now, of course, we all hear a lot of different messages as we're growing up, but I think there are some of them that stick with us and frame our experience, particularly as teenagers and young women. I call these our theme tunes. And I don't know about you, but many of mine as a teenager were negative. I don't look right, I'm not old enough, I don't fit in. And we get these messages from somewhere. And I think I got them because I was comparing myself to an idea that I ought to be. And I got that from glossy magazines, from the television, from the things that some of the children and adults around me said. And it was an idea of how I should be that was unachievable and restrictive. I could never quite measure up to. I couldn't be older, thinner, better looking, do more things right all at once. But it didn't spend me, and I'm sure many of you, it didn't stop me, spending endless hours trying. Now, it's my belief that this practice of listening to older women and hearing those messages more could actually help us to access our own wisdom more. Because the advice that I got from these older women could help us to move away from the messages that we find in glossy magazines and TV programs and towards the kind of advice I heard from older women that helps us to accept the whole of who we are as women, the things that matter to us, the choices that we make, the way we look, the way we use resources, and ultimately help us to access our own wisdom and to accept the paradox which, as another of my favourite poets, Maya Angelou, puts it, we're more alike than unalike. We see, or at least I did, our stories reflected in the stories of the women that came before us, and yet we are free to choose our own path through this lifetime. And the more I believe we can travel that path with inspiration from real women's lived experience, rather than the false standards that we're sold from so many other directions, the more I believe we can work together to dream a new world. Thank you.